Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 86, Wealth and Class. Things have changed considerably since the last time we surveyed the broad outlines of Roman life. Episode 28, Taking Stock, for those of you keeping score at home. Back then, the Romans had just emerged into a world in which they had conquered Greece and annihilated the last vestiges of Carthage. As you'll recall, this total victory over all meaningful rivals for power was a turning point in the transition from republic to empire. Bereft of any unifying external threat, ambitious politicians began to describe their domestic political enemies in the same us versus them, life or death terms that they had once reserved for foreign enemies like the Samnites or the Carthaginians. At first, this manifested merely as a more violent extension of the old class struggle between patrician and plebe, as with the careers of the Gracchi brothers. But soon, the once solidly unified aristocracy began to turn on itself, and Marius and Sulla, then Caesar and Octavian, tore the old republic asunder and created in its place a new imperial order, a semi-divine military dictatorship that ruled the Mediterranean from its seat on the Palatine Hill. We now find ourselves then on the opposite side of that evolutionary curve. Back in episode 28, we were setting the stage for the fall of the Republic. Today, we are observing the result of that all-important social and political transformation. By the middle of the 2nd century, the Republic was not just a thing of the past. It was a thing barely remembered. And more than that, it was a thing no longer even actively pined for. The Romans, in a word, had changed. The political power they undisputedly wielded, the wealth that poured into their public treasuries, the new ideas, religions, and philosophies that had been ingested from Greece and the Near East had all conspired to fundamentally alter the Roman character. Whether it was even in its own time an unattainable ideal is a question for another time, but the Romans of the Republic had supposedly been all about simple homes, strong families, steadfast piety, and above all, an impassive devotion to the public good. The Romans of the Empire, though, as pointed out even by contemporary critics like Juvenal, had become a society of self-indulgent sloths, whose lives revolved around ostentatious displays of wealth, petty gossip, and the next round of games. At least, that was true of the upper classes. The lower and middle classes, who had once been freeholding farmers, the very root of Republican virtue, were now either oppressed tenants on sprawling aristocratic estates, or else unemployed and crammed into Rome, living what could barely be called lives on the public dole. And this is all to say nothing of the legions. Once comprised entirely of citizen farmer soldiers, the Roman legions had not only lost their amateur status, they were now not even Roman legions anymore. Aside from a few officers, the standing army that defended the frontiers of the empire was, by the 2nd century, made up entirely of provincials. Lured into service because soldiering was basically the only real means of upward social mobility left in most corners of the empire, the men who served in the army lived and retired and died in the provinces within which they served. By this point, the only thing dividing legionary from auxiliary was training, equipment, and pay. The only Italians who even contemplated service in the legions were the poorest of the poor, looking for a way out of their wretched poverty, and ambitious aristocrats who were looking to pad their resumes with a year or two of military experience before settling into their comfortable public careers. But even here, the number of Italian nobles who went down that road was dwindling by the day. Most of the ambitious aristocrats left these days were themselves provincials, albeit rich provincials, who were, like Trajan or Hadrian, looking to gain entrance into the imperial power structure. The Romans were, for the most part, content to let others do the heavy lifting for them, while they frittered away their aimless lives and sent the wealth of an empire their forefathers had won for them down the drain of their vomitoriums. Am I getting carried away? Okay, I'm getting carried away a little bit. But only in that vomitoriums, as we popularly conceive of them, didn't really exist in ancient Rome. To set the stage, then, for the next evolutionary step of the empire, from Augustus's Principate to Diocletian's Dominate, I'm going to spend the next couple of episodes exploring how the empire, its citizens, subjects, culture, and economy were constituted during the age of the Antonines. Hopefully then, we'll all have a much richer understanding of how and why imperial Rome stagnated, calcified, and then almost broke apart completely less than a century later. Plus, all of this stuff is just intrinsically interesting. As was the case throughout Roman history, the most important thing to understand about the empire is that it was defined by gross inequality. Inequality on a scale that would make Ayn Rand blush. To put it mathematically, the Roman economic classes were divided on a logarithmic rather than an arithmetic scale. To describe it accurately, you basically start with a vast horde of poor citizens and go up from there. 10 times richer than the poor was a group 10 times smaller that could be defined as lower middle class, though the only obvious benefit of their higher annual income was that they did not qualify for any state welfare, and thus wound up struggling just as mightily as the poor to stay afloat. 10 times richer than this lower middle class was a much smaller group who we might consider upper middle class, wealthy enough to live a comfortable life and qualify for equestrian status, but nonetheless politically and economically dwarfed by the exponentially larger treasuries of the senatorial class. The minimum annual wealth requirement for admission into the senatorial order was 1 million sesterces, orders of magnitude from the 20,000 sesterces it took to simply exist on a daily basis, but at first glance, not much more than the 400,000 it took to qualify as an equestrian. But at second glance, there was, as Pliny the Younger pointed out, a vast gulf amongst the senators themselves. Pliny reckoned himself worth somewhere around 20 million sesterces, and he explicitly denied that he was a, quote, rich man. The richest of the rich, the men who would actually describe themselves as such, were a handful of senators worth 100 million sesterces or more. In the hands of these men lay the real power of Rome. To put this all another way, it has been calculated that during the reign of Trajan, only 150,000 of the 1.2 million people living in Rome lived free and independent of public charity, and of those, only a few dozen could hope to wield any economic or political influence. The rest were trapped between the teeming masses and super elite. On the one hand, comfortable in their bourgeois lifestyles, on the other, politically impotent. But of course, above them all was the emperor, whose fortune dwarfed the richest of the rich, a fact delighted in by the middle class, whose feelings of impotence were somewhat mitigated by the fact that even the super-rich themselves controlled what amounted to an imperial rounding error. By the 2nd century, the combined weight of imperial holdings and personally inherited fortunes allowed an emperor to act with the impunity that defined his position. Some of this fortune was ruthlessly obtained. Nero, for example, confiscated the 6 largest estates in the province of Africa, making him and his successors the de facto landlords of practically the whole of North Africa. Some, extracted in hard-driven business arrangements, for example, imperial leases to mine in Spain, were obtained with the proviso that half the output went into the imperial treasury, and some was simply obtained personally by the emperor and withheld from the state books, as with Trajan's Dacian treasure trove and Augustus's personal claim on Egypt. This incalculable imperial fortune was, as they say, the real power behind the throne. We often speak of the emperor's authority resting mostly on the backs of the legions he controlled, but of course their loyalty was secured only by an increasingly generous series of pay increases, donatives, and bonuses. In the end, it was the privy purse, more than the sword and shield, that secured the emperor's power. So when it comes to drawing a graph of the social and economic classes in Antonine Rome, the line runs barely above zero most of the way, before sharply spiking up through the equestrians and senators on its way to the emperor, whose singular position approached infinity. Running alongside the economic class structure of free citizens were the slaves who served them all. Slavery had always been, and would always be, the bedrock upon which Roman economic life was built, and the age of the Antonines was no different. Though, as I said last week, the Romans had been trending towards more humane policies, slavery was never going to be a picnic for anyone. A few educated slaves attached to very wealthy houses lived comfortable lives and wielded very real power and influence, but the vast majority of those in bondage worked the massive estates owned by the aristocracy, or were sent to the mines, a virtual death sentence. In between these two extremes, slaves served families and businessmen of every social and economic class as cooks, maids, nurses, barbers, secretaries, messengers, accountants, stable hands, really any job beneath the dignity of a free citizen, which turned out to be most of them. It is very difficult to estimate how many slaves lived in the empire at any given time, but working with the same population figure of 1.2 million or so for Rome, about 400,000 of those were probably slaves, making the ratio of free to slave something like 2 to 1, which, as you can imagine, left the Romans in constant fear of a great slave revolt, a distressingly plausible scenario that led to more than one sleepless night. New slaves were created in one of three ways. By far the largest segment were prisoners of war. Men, women, and children caught up in the nets of the legions following their latest conquest. When I've said in the past that after this or that battle, the Romans went plundering and carried off anything that wasn't nailed down, that included the people themselves. Slave trading was a lucrative business, and a soldier could often hope to turn a better profit selling off a family he had held at sword point than he could their shiny valuables. And when I said that there were civilian camp followers who traveled along with the legions on campaign, slave traders were right there front and center, ready to take the captives off the soldiers' hands in exchange for cash. The second method of enslavement came from a law dating back to Romulus himself that allowed a father to sell his children into slavery. Obviously, by the days of the empire, this was a practice long out of fashion, but it was there and in desperate times did still happen. The last method was to be born of a female slave. Though this happened more often than the sale of free children, slave populations were not known to be prolific breeders, both by the circumstances of their captivity, which often precluded romance, but also because if a man and woman could find the time and opportunity to engage in romance, damning their unborn children to slavery was a moral hurdle that they were often unable to clear. Better to wait it out and see if one or the both of them could attain their freedom before bringing children into the world. This meant that slave stocks in the age of the Antonines, while immense, were dwindling. While the Third Jewish War helped, Trajan was really the last emperor to pump up the supply, and he was a generation in the grave when Antoninus took over. Hence, it would seem, laws designed to protect the well-being of the existing slave population, so necessary to how the economy functioned. Throughout Roman history, slaves were seen not just as useful tools, but also as living status symbols for their masters. This is why, amongst the wealthiest families at least, the division of labor amongst slaves was taken to absurd extremes. One slave was designated to help a master with his daily dressing, another assigned to handle formal occasions, another for military uniforms, a fourth for dress military uniforms. One slave to deliver dinner plates, another to take them away. One slave to open the door to guests, another to escort them inside, a third to sit them down. The point was not that all of these tasks couldn't be performed by a single slave, but rather, look at how many slaves I have. In a culture that never really went in for fancy furniture or dishes or art, and even the largest homes in the city were of modest size due to space constraints, the abundance of slaves was the one visible way to show off wealth. This absurd and ego-driven labor redundancy was mocked endlessly, but wealthy families were nonetheless forced to worry about a dangerous slave gap opening up that might render them socially inferior to their neighbor. At the lower end of the social spectrum, the labor redundancy was not as evident, but still, a middle-class man would be embarrassed to show himself in public without at least a handful of slaves surrounding him, and Juvenal remarked that if a defendant showed up for trial and his lawyer arrived with fewer than 8 slaves in tow, he could be pretty well assured that he was going to lose the case. Basically, the modern equivalent of a polyester-clad shyster arriving to take on an Armani-clad corporate lawyer. The slaves owned and paraded around by their masters were treated with varying degrees of respect and gentleness, but by the 2nd century, treatment generally skewed towards that of a well-liked pet in the city and a respected pack animal in the country. Masters who kicked and beat their slaves, or did not take care of them when they were sick, were as much reviled as a rotten pet owner is today. The greatest love a master could show for his slave, though, was not to give him or her a soft bed and good food. It was to set them free. Manumission, as the freeing of slaves was called, became by the 2nd century a practice much in vogue. Unlike modern slavery, where freed slaves were a microscopic exception to the rule of lifetime bondage, Roman slaves could reasonably hope that if they served their masters well, that at some point they would be set free. Beyond the spontaneous freedom that was often declared by masters on special circumstances, or as the patriarch neared death, many slaves were allowed to earn and save money during their time in service, with the aim of eventually purchasing their freedom. During Augustus's time, the freeing of slaves started to become a badge of honor among the upper classes, leading to a generosity arms race that needed to be closed by the emperor before every slave in the empire was freed. So Augustus set limits both on the minimum age a slave could be free, 30, and how many slaves a master could free at one time, 100 per 500 slaves. But the freeing of slaves remained common practice, leading to the rise of a new class of citizen who I have mentioned off and on during the show, the freedman. The freedman enjoyed limited rights within the empire and was never mistaken for a full citizen, but for the most part, aside from the casual sneers directed their way for their servile origins, freedmen could reasonably hope to become fully functional and often prominent members of society. When the freedman was released from his formal bondage, though, it did not free him from obligation to his former master. The old rules of client and patron still defined Roman daily life, which we'll get to a bit later, and a freedman naturally became the faithful client of his old master, further adding to that master's prestige. During the Republic, freedmen were restricted in what they could be and do once they were free, but by the reign of Claudius, most of those restrictions had been lifted, and Claudius himself set a precedent by stocking the imperial bureaucracy with educated ex-slaves who had the capacity to perform the mundane tasks of empire without the haughty disdain for clerical grunt work shown by free citizens. But once free Romans realized how much power such clerical grunt work afforded these lowly ex-slaves, they began to agitate for reform, and Domitian seized the opportunity to staff his bureaucracy with men of equestrian status, not only to turn out the freedmen who had run the show previously and become experts at political graft, but also to command the loyalty of the equestrians, who had been marginalized by the wealth of the Senate on the one hand and the outsized influence of the freedmen on the other. The Antonine emperors continued to follow Domitian's precedent, favoring equestrians over freedmen when it came to staffing. But despite this political setback, freedmen as a whole could still expect to compete on an equal footing economically with the freeborn and establish comfortable lives for themselves. And, as I alluded earlier, a freedman's children were born free citizens, rendering any future prejudice moot. The economic activity that Romans and freedmen and provincials and slaves collectively engaged and competed in naturally varied from place to place, but it mostly divided into two main realms, city work and country work. To take the latter first, country work meant farming. By the 2nd century, the existence of the free-holding small farmer was largely a thing of the past, though, and peasants mostly wound up living as tenant farmers on large aristocratic estates. But of course, the massive influx of slave labor pushed many of the free families out of the country and into the city, an economic problem we'll deal with in a second that would plague the empire until its final days. The farms of the classical world, like farms of today, were set to either produce the food that fed the empire or the cash crops that made it wealthy. The basic staple crops were wheat, millet, and barley, and together they formed the foundation of the grain and cereal-based Roman diet. The basic cash crops were olives and grapes, used mostly for oil and wine respectively. These latter two were not only sold domestically, but were also practically the only valuable exports the empire could muster to counteract the effects of what many considered a dangerously unbalanced trade deficit with the rest of the world. When we get into a more detailed description of the provinces, we'll refine a bit what came from where and why. So for now, I'm just going to leave it that though the political foundations of Rome was no longer the noble citizen farmer, the vast majority of families living in the empire were still engaged in agricultural work of some kind or another. Just like peasants of all ages, they lived within sight of where they had been born and died within sight of the plot of land they worked their whole lives. Visiting one of the empire's major urban centers, let alone Rome itself, was a ludicrous fantasy. But as ludicrous a thought as it was for most, the cities of the empire still teemed with the energy of millions. The various occupations of urban Romans were as varied as they were in any city today. Importers, wholesalers, retailers, bankers, cooks, innkeepers, masons, druggists, potters, tanners, jewelers, teachers, and actors all lived side by side and wheeled and dealed daily to get ahead, hedge against the future, jump at any opportunity, or make up for a loss. But of course, these gainfully employed citizens, ranging from the hand-to-mouth lower middle class to the relatively wealthy equestrian merchants, were far outnumbered by the mass of often unemployed wretches who lived on public assistance. The emperors tried to keep these poor masses quiet and peaceful with free grain and free games, which the poor gobbled up readily, but they also tried to provide honest work to keep them occupied, one of the major rationales behind the building explosions that transformed Rome between the reigns of Domitian and Hadrian. Despite the public assistance, life was hard at the bottom of the ladder. The grain dole, important as it was, couldn't sustain a poor family, as it was only calculated to feed free men, not their wives and children. The lower middle class didn't even receive this minimal subsidy, and were thus left to fend for themselves, their meager scrapings somehow making them too rich for public compassion. Even members of the better-off equestrian class often found themselves running a persistent household budget deficit just to stay afloat. These gaping financial holes had to be filled by someone, and so it was left to the patron, he of the ancient patron-client model of social kinship that had defined Roman society for centuries, to do the filling. That relationship had once been an overt quid pro quo of political support in exchange for favors and support in times of need, much like the machine politics of 19th century America. But following the collapse of the Republic, and with it the need for voters, it had evolved into a sort of second-track form of public assistance. Every morning, clients would come knocking at the door of their patrons. The patrons would welcome them in and turn over a few coins to honor the respect the clients paid them. In time, the once informal surprise gifts became formalized and expected, and the annual income of just about everyone in the city began to rely heavily on patronage. Clients were further able to cultivate more than one patron at a time, and the most active among them would bounce from house to house each morning, pocketing a few coins here and there, until they had amassed a tidy sum that would keep them going for the rest of the day, until they woke up the next morning and repeated the ritual all over again. If this was considered poor form, it was only in passing, as everyone seemed to be doing everything they could to stay alive in an economic climate that was unpredictable and harsh even in the best of times. Besides, the only people who had any money were the super rich anyway, and so when they gave, you had to grab. Though wealth and class in Antonine Rome were not permanent states, and no one, not even slaves, couldn't at least hope for a better life, in practice, there was very little in the way of upward mobility. The rich had gotten massively richer, and they tended to keep their wealth in the family. Every generation a few clever merchants would rise, and a few bumbling heirs would fall. But for the most part, the rich stayed rich, the poor stayed poor, and everyone else just kind of floated along in the middle, wondering how long they could avoid the poorhouse themselves. While the so-called 5 good emperors are to be commended for revising and extending the alimentary system, and perpetuating the grain doles, and stepping in to personally underwrite emergency relief when disaster struck, when you really think about it, they were actually downright miserly. They personally controlled something like half of the empire's GDP, and all they had for the poverty-stricken masses was an inadequate supply of grain, some construction jobs, and the promise that if their tenement building caught fire, that the emperor would cover their burial expenses. You don't have to be a fire-breathing Marxist to find problems with that, or to think twice about the moral underpinnings of a society that was quite content to live with a Gini coefficient approaching 1. Next week, though, we'll get into what all of these people did when they weren't simply trying to survive. How they educated their young, what they did for fun, how they worshiped their gods, and what gods or God they worshipped. This last bit is of critical importance because the age of the Antonines was a transitional period when the old state-sponsored polytheism of Jupiter and Juno and Minerva and Apollo were in decline, and the new Oriental mystery religions were on the rise. The old religions were lately seen as little more than a series of empty rituals, while the new Eastern religions promised adherents a deeper and more meaningful understanding of the universe and man's place within it. It was during these years that the cult of the Jewish carpenter really began its exponential growth phase that would eventually lead to its envelopment of the entire Mediterranean world. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 87, Thinking and Feeling. Last time, we discussed the general economic and political ordering of Roman society in the age of the Antonines. Today, I want to add additional layers to that discussion by talking a bit about how these various classes felt about education, religion, and philosophy. Obviously, your outlook depended a great deal on your position in society, but as with most things, it was never quite that simple. Wealth and class usually locked Romans into inescapable social roles, but it did not necessarily predetermine their worldviews, what they held dear, what they believed, and to whom, if anyone, they prayed. One young senator reacted to his inherited wealth by turning towards Stoic self-denial, while his neighbor embraced the joyfully nihilistic leanings of the Epicureans. One middle-class merchant took the loss of his inventory to fire as proof that he needed to double down on his offerings to Jupiter, while his competitor took it to mean that the old gods had forsaken him and that he must find a new religion to explain and justify his sorry lot in life. One dirt-poor pleb looked at the squalor in which he lived and decided to enlist in the army with the hope of rising through the ranks and maybe retiring to a comfortable farm someday, while his brother said bag it and went off to bet on the races. There were general outlooks that defined each class, but by no means did everyone march in lockstep with one another. Identity formation in ancient Rome often followed the same path it does today. At first, a child was locked into their family structure, with the attitudes and material possessions of their parents dominating their understanding of the world. But at a certain point, that child made contact with the outside world, free from the active mediation, translation, or protection of their parents. For most of us, as for many Roman children, that point of contact was primary school. Now, of course, the middle and upper classes were the only ones who could afford school for their children, as there was no universal free education as we know it today. So we're going to briefly leave behind the poor to learn what they can of the world on the streets of the city or in the fields of the country, and focus on the curriculum of the wealthier children. But do not fret for the poor boys and girls too much. Critics, both modern and ancient alike, cringe when they contemplate the damage wrought by the inadequate, boring, backwards, limited, and cruel years of primary education that were endured by the future leaders of the empire. Because the one major upshot of Roman early education was that it left its pupils intellectually incurious, distrustful of teachers, and generally glad to be rid of anything that reminded them of school, books, or learning in general. Not exactly the values of a ruling class with staying power. In the days of the Republic, things were different. One of the major responsibilities of a father, if not the overriding responsibility, was to handle the education of his children. In practice, this meant the boys and not really the girls, but that aside, it was very important for a father to develop and oversee the education of his offspring. Cato the Elder famously spent much of his time focused on the intellectual and physical growth of his sons and demanded that his colleagues do the same. But as the empire grew and enveloped the East, it became fashionable to turn over the children to educated Greek slaves for schooling. The father might consult with the teachers to develop lessons and monitor progress, but gradually the whole process was outsourced to the tutors and then, finally, to the group learning sessions we are all familiar with today. For those of you out there who are critical of how we handle early education in modern Western society, I can assure you that the horrors awaiting the Roman school children were 100 times worse. The class curriculum for children aged 7 to 12, in this case we are talking about both boys and girls who seem to have attended school together, was limited to reading, writing, and arithmetic. Students would use wax tablets to practice writing and an abacus for basic math. This seems well and good until you dig a little deeper. For starters, students were required to learn the names of the letters of the alphabet first, without any context for what they might mean to later word construction. They would repeat the names of the letters until they had memorized the proper order. This memorization went on before the teacher even showed them what the letters looked like, further exacerbating the mindless repetition of the process. Once the letters were named, the teacher would reveal what the letters looked like and then command the student to copy the forms on their tablets. Without any initial instruction into how to hold or use their stylus, they were suddenly ordered to copy perfectly forms that they had never before seen. Mistakes in this or any other subject was met with corporal punishment, raps on the wrist for small mistakes, and full beatings for repeated failures. Arithmetic held no hope of relief, as primary math boiled down to repeating over and over and over again the basic numerals and then repeating over and over and over again the results of their combinations or multiplications. These rote memorization exercises could eventually be recited without the need for the child to even switch his or her brain on. And of course, the mind-numbing repetition was compounded by the fact that Roman children went to school every single day. No weekends, sporadic holidays. 5 solid years of dull memorization, recitation, and copying, an endless monotony broken only by the occasional beating. I've heard horror stories about Catholic school, but honestly, it sounds like a lazy day at the park compared to what Roman children endured. Marcus Aurelius considered the fact that his guardians kept him out of primary school altogether as one of the greatest things that ever happened to him in his entire life. Once the student had had all the joy of knowledge sucked and beaten out of them, they were ready for secondary education, which, for the Romans, meant grammar and rhetoric. Grammar was taught by focusing on a rigid canon of classics, featuring Greek writers like Homer and Menander, and Latin writers like Terence and Ennius. The rigidity of the canon was apparently so absolute that it was something of a radical revolution when more recent figures like Virgil and Seneca began to appear on the required reading lists. The teaching of grammar did not depart too far from the form of primary school, with emphasis being placed on memorization and oral recitation of whole passages. The focus was never on the content of the works in question, but rather on the words and the order in which they were used. Educated Romans may not have been great poets, but they were pedants of the highest order, which of course made their cocktail parties awesome. The final stop on the road of Roman education, left only to those who truly had the means to pay for it, was rhetoric. For the Romans, who so highly valued oratory, rhetoric was the top of the intellectual pyramid. But again, the lesson plans were so pedantic and ludicrous that it is difficult to fathom what they really thought they were getting out of it. Beyond endlessly spelling out every single way a potential sentence could be phrased, "It's good to see you this morning. This morning, it is good to see you. Seeing you this morning is good." The primary focus of the rhetorician was to prepare his students for life in the highly litigious public sphere. This meant working constantly at debate. The teacher would invent some thorny case and then have his students work up prosecutions and defenses. As with the grammarian, the focus was on eloquence, presentation, and theatricality before content was even considered. These were not philosophers debating moral truths. These were sophists debating who could deliver a better speech. Once the course in rhetoric was complete, usually in the late teens, the educated Roman was as educated as your average educated Roman was ever going to get. You can't help but notice, then, all the things missing from their quote-unquote education. Science, advanced math, music, geography, economics, literature beyond a few approved classics, and art were all completely ignored. This totally stagnant, unappealing, and downright informationless educational system would haunt the Romans as they tried to hold on to their empire in the face of the foreign and domestic turmoil that would soon rock them in the 3rd century. Going forward, the best and brightest of any given generation would often prove to be mediocre and dim, with the most talented often succeeding despite what they had learned in school rather than because of it. This general failure of education, though, which managed to simultaneously stunt both the right and left sides of the Roman brain, did not stunt the Roman yearning for answers to the great questions. Why are we here? What are we doing? What's the point? And is there a point? Finding no answers in the books that they had had beaten into them as children, most 2nd century Romans turned to either religion or philosophy for solace, the former absorbing the majority, the latter a small but dedicated minority. The religion the people turned to, though, to deal with that angle first, was not the religion of their mothers and fathers. By the 2nd century, the titular deities of Rome were losing their hold on the people. Belief in Jupiter, or sacrifices to Apollo, or celebrations in honor of Minerva continued out of sheer inertia, but there was no faith underlying the rituals anymore. The impact of Rome's conquest of the East was felt everywhere, but nowhere was it more dramatically felt than in the religious revolution it unleashed. For years, Roman officials had tried to maintain the preeminence of the old Olympians, but despite various decrees banning the cult of Isis, and overt persecution of early Christians or Egyptian astrologers, Roman faith continued to leak out of the temple of Jupiter from 1,000 tiny holes. For the upper classes, these exciting new religions promised a form of enlightenment denied them by their empty, merely rhetorical educations, while the lower classes listened intently as priests told them that the material world was a transient delusion and that soon enough their souls would be set free. Slaves, women, and common soldiers would flock to Christianity in particular, and its radical profession that all were equal in the eyes of God. Though the various Eastern cults differed in their particulars, almost all involved some sort of initiation process, and the promise that once initiated, followers would be privy to secret mystical truths. These secret mystical truths usually revolved around using esoteric astrology to predict the future, and then the use of complex rituals to secure good fortune. Best of all, barring a few exceptions, the various Eastern cults never tried to stop their new Roman converts from joining other cults, and in many cases encouraged them to do so. According to the faithful, this was a simple recognition that there was no harm in comparing and combining religious knowledge for the greater good of the adherent, while satirists noted that more likely huckster cult leaders felt that there was no harm in each of them getting a bite at the same rich apple. Conservative Romans bemoaned the rise of these cults and the strange behavior they provoked, women plunging into the Tiber during winter, men crawling on their hands and knees through the streets, and children babbling incoherent warnings about the danger of Saturn being in the house of Osiris. But they were unable to provide any alternative to satisfy the converting masses. Just as with literature, the old Roman religion had been purged of its meaning, leaving behind only a series of empty rituals that no one understood or cared about. Superstition kept them performing the rituals, but they no longer excited the passionate feeling that they once had. The Eastern cults, in contrast, were fresh and exciting, and filled with just the right mixture of secrecy to get them hooked, exotic cosmology to keep them interested, and promises of eternal personal salvation, which was apparently what everyone decided they were now searching for. During this period of transforming religious values, the religion destined to leave all the others in the dust began to really gain its foothold in the Western world. Christianity was in many respects similar to other Eastern cults. It had a secret initiation process, strange rituals, and an exotic take on the universe. But in other respects, it was radically different. Reflecting its Jewish roots, Christians were staunch monotheists who demanded their followers forsake all other religions. This requirement of total commitment to a single religion was practically unknown in a pagan world where idols, gods, and rituals were considered interchangeable. But this was not the only thing that set the Christians apart. In the century between the death of Jesus, supposedly around 30 AD, and the reign of Antoninus, Christian dogma had been filtered through the various, sometimes contradictory lenses of the early church fathers like St. Peter and St. Paul, and so the version of the religion that began to flourish in the 2nd century AD was thoroughly Hellenized and focused as much on sexual denial and withdrawal from the material Greco-Roman world as it was in preparing for the second coming of Christ, which everyone agreed was just around the corner. This was all weird enough to provoke the scorn of average Romans, but Christianity further invited ridicule by willingly embracing the politically and economically downtrodden, slaves, the poor, and, critically for its early success, women. This religion of slaves was viewed with suspicion by the existing power structure, who were further provoked by the Christian unwillingness to offer sacrifices to the deified emperors, a simple request for political obedience that even the combative Jews had bowed to. Though it was in their own way, they offered sacrifice to Yahweh in the name of the Caesars. But the Christians refused any compromise, and so incurred the wrath of Roman administrators across the empire. But despite these persecutions, Christianity continued to gain faithful adherents who were willing, and sometimes even proud, to die for their religion. The question of how and why early Christianity managed to flourish in the face of almost overwhelming odds is too big of a question to answer just now. I promise there will be much more to say about Christianity before the end of the history of Rome. So for now, I will simply remind you of the point I made last week. By orders of magnitude, the politically and economically downtrodden made up the bulk of the population in the Roman Empire. When Christianity began speaking a language that empowered these forever marginalized groups, well, the rest is history, you know? Apart from the religious seekers of the 2nd century, who delved into mystery cults to satisfy their desire to know the meaning of life, a small minority of educated elites pursued a slightly different course, believing philosophy, rather than religion, held the key to understanding the universe. In many ways, ancient philosophy was indistinguishable from ancient religion, with the key distinction being merely that philosophy rested its case on human rationality rather than faith in exotic rituals. But other than that, they both had basic tenets of belief and action, quasi-godlike historical figures to worship, and high priests to instruct the faithful. In Rome, the two dominant strains of philosophy were Stoicism and Epicureanism. Both were disdained by the average Roman, who thought the extreme behavior each branch preached was incompatible with everyday good taste, and only a few dedicated thinkers embraced philosophy over the rising tide of Eastern mysticism. Not that either Stoicism or Epicureanism taught the kind of extreme behavior the stereotyping masses usually thought they did, but hey, when you've escaped childhood with an extreme aversion to further education, ignorance of philosophical precepts does not exactly come as a surprise. We'll wind up going into a bit more detail on Stoicism as we move into the reign of Marcus Aurelius, that philosophy's most famous Roman advocate. But just to lay some initial groundwork, Stoicism as a school of thought was founded by Zeno of Citium in the 3rd century BC as an offshoot or a continuation of the work begun by the Cynics in the 5th century BC. Taking its name from the Stoa, or porch under which Zeno taught, the Stoic philosophy was grounded in a belief that emotion ought to be subordinate to reason, and that this subordination allowed men to live a virtuous life in accord with nature. It is important to point out that the Stoics were not anti-emotional robots. They just believed that negative emotions were highly destructive and could only be reined in by reason. Discord and chaos reigned when men allowed their passions to get the better of them, especially passions that raged uselessly against the unfolding plan of nature. Stoicism was thus an attempt to marry the determinism of the universe with the free will of the individual. Correct judgment conformed with the laws of nature and produced the calm mind and spirit that was the desired end state for the Stoic adherent. Stoicism was surprisingly egalitarian in its message, though not in the same way Christianity was. Seneca famously reminded his readers, "Kindly remember that he whom you call your slave sprang from the same stock, is smiled upon by the same skies, and on equal terms with yourself breathes, lives, and dies." The point being that deep down we are all the same, suffer the same, yearn the same. But where Christianity promised those slaves eventual salvation, the Stoics simply exhorted men and women of every station to accept the world and their place within it. Just as a Marcus Aurelius must resign himself each morning to meeting the joyless burdens of his office, so too must the slave resign himself to the joyless burdens of his. Ambition ought to be confined to a desire to play your part as best you can each and every day. That Stoicism did not turn out to be the religion of the slave should not come as a shock to anyone. Despite its reputation for producing dour, joyless men, Stoicism flourished throughout the Greco-Roman world for the positive ideal it gave many to strive for. No one, especially the Romans, could argue with the Stoics' four cardinal virtues, which they derived from Plato: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. That the average Roman of the 2nd century disdained the committed Stoic was evidence more of their own anti-intellectual prejudices than any real problem with the philosophy itself. It took hard work and constant self-reflection to properly practice Stoicism, and let's face it, hard work and self-reflection were not necessarily the principles upon which the empire was now founded. On the other end of the philosophical spectrum were the Epicureans, who, though they pursued the same end state as the Stoics, a calm and tranquil mind, they went about it in a very different way. Founded in the early 200s BC by Epicurus, the purpose of this new philosophy was to help students attain a state of mind free from fear, pain, or turmoil. This was a radical notion in the ancient world, a place notorious for its fear, pain, and turmoil. Where Stoicism met the challenges of life head-on and demanded that they be endured, Epicurus exhorted his followers to identify that which caused them pain and then purge it from their everyday lives. Though the message was often misunderstood to mean that one ought to embrace hedonistic pleasure-seeking, the Epicureans were usually far more modest than their non-Epicurean neighbors. Guzzling wine is a fleeting joy that is balanced by the morning's hangover. Sexual inhibition leads to all manner of jealousies, fights, and misunderstandings. Hedonism, in other words, usually leads to more pain than pleasure. The true Epicurean simply cultivated a close circle of friends and enjoyed their company while dining on simple meals and partaking in non-disruptive pastimes like sitting and chatting. They took no part in politics, tried not to get involved in lawsuits, refrained from commercial activity, and generally tried to mind their own business. The only responsibility an Epicurean really had towards other people was to do unto them as he would have them do unto him. If the whole point of life was to avoid pain, there was no sense in inflicting it on others. That would just be wrong. The biggest thing Epicurus tried to remind his students was that they need not fear death. The fear of death was the single biggest source of all the chaos, disruptive violence, and anger that permeated society, and if one could conquer that fear, everything else would fall into place. To this end, he came out fully as a sort of proto-atheist, denying completely that the gods played an active role in the lives of mortal men, and that there was any sort of afterlife that you needed to worry about. You are alive now and have sensation. When you die, sensation will cease. There is nothing to fear because there will be nothing to feel. What you have today is all you will ever have, So don't waste your time spinning your wheels, worrying about something that will A, inevitably come whenever it wants, and B, won't hurt anyway. Beyond the misunderstanding over what the pursuit of Epicurean pleasure meant, it was this atheism that caused the Epicureans the most problem amongst their superstitious and highly religious neighbors. Because when you put the two together, you get a freaky stereotype of a nihilistic atheist who would just as soon ravage your daughter as look at you. Nothing could have been further from the truth, and by the standards of the day, the average Epicurean, like the average Stoic, was a model citizen. What few demerits you could honestly assess them with comes mostly from an unwillingness to engage in public life, which was a bit like a Roman choosing not to breathe. But it had nothing to do with the fact that you had to keep calling the cops on them every Saturday night. The philosophy students of 2nd century Rome, be they Stoic or Epicurean, usually came out of the upper classes, men with the means to indulge their peculiar habits. But not all of them were rich and educated. One of my favorite groups of people, and no doubt one of the least popular groups in their own time, were the poor philosophers. Lampooned off and on over the years, these were men who often had no prospects and no hope of any work beyond dull manual labor, who suddenly became enamored with philosophy, grew their beards long, and wandered the streets criticizing the material obsessions of their fellow citizens in between requests for handouts. These street gurus, who assured anyone who would listen that their poverty was not only a chosen state, but also of the highest virtue, combined effortlessly the roles of crazy bum and freeloading artist to produce a character unique to the classical world, the panhandling philosopher. The streets of Rome would have been a less vibrant place without their angry harangues and subsequent requests for cash. In all of these things we are left, I must say, with the picture of a civilization on the verge of decay. Education had become stagnant and counterproductive. The elites were either withdrawing into weird mystery cults or esoteric philosophy, and everyone else was focused on just trying to stay alive. The vision, dedication, and camaraderie of the Republic was all but gone, leaving in its wake an ignorant, self-absorbed society that had no idea what horrors were lurking beyond the frontiers, just waiting to smash the comfortable world the Romans had begun to take for granted. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, everything we've covered today has been little more than a thumbnail sketch of a thumbnail sketch. Any one of these topics, Roman education, the Eastern mystery cults, or ancient philosophy, could easily become the topic of standalone podcasts of their own, and so I would encourage you to take this episode as an outline for further study, rather than, say, the comprehensive final word on Roman rhetoric, which I can assure you it was not. If any of this stuff sparks your imagination, remember that Amazon or Powell's are both positively overflowing with books on all of these topics. Usually at cut-rate prices, too, because as much as we know how fascinating Seneca's Letters from a Stoic is going to be, the free market is under the impression that it can only charge $5 for it. Next week, we're going to follow the Romans through the course of an average day, from waking up and heading out the door, to the barber shop, the law courts, the afternoon bath, and the evening meal. 2 weeks from now, we're going to go on a tour of the provinces and wrap our heads around what the Romans controlled, how they controlled it, and what each region brought to the greater empire, be it natural resources or simply more soldiers for the legions. That will bring us up to the 100th episode, which I'm really looking forward to since you guys have filled the comment thread with some great questions. I'm going to put a deadline on submissions, though, so I can have a little bit of time to sort through it all. So if you haven't posted your question by the time next week's episode comes out, then you're just going to have to wait for episode 200 to come around before I'll be able to address it. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, episode 88, A Day in the Life. When the sun rose, so too did the Romans. For the country population, this was only natural. After all, they had to get out in the fields and get working. But even in the cities, Roman daily life revolved around daylight. Across the empire, whether farmer or lawyer, slave or emperor, the first crack of light was your cue to get up and get going. The Romans made a number of civilizational leaps that helped bridge the gap between prehistory and the modern world, but one conspicuous absence was any sort of public streetlight network in their cities. This meant that whatever you need to get done today has to be done while the sun is still up. Once darkness fell, you'd better be safely back home, or you're going to be in for a long night. So there was no time to waste, and the Romans wasted no time. There was no such thing as a morning shower, a leisurely breakfast, or even a cup of coffee. The Romans slept in their underclothes, woke up, slipped on their overclothes, grabbed a glass of water, and maybe a few nuts or a piece of bread for breakfast, and were out the door literally minutes later. Vespasian liked to brag that he could go from sleep to ready for work in 30 seconds. But just because all Romans got started at dawn did not mean that they were all natural larks, as poor old Marcus Aurelius testified in a quote near and dear to my own owlish heart. Obviously pained to be forever awakened at such a hideous hour as dawn, the Stoic emperor chronicled his recurring internal debates as he fought each morning to do the right thing. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, as a human being, I have to go to work. Why am I complaining if I'm going to do what I was born to do, the things I was brought into this world to do? Is this really what I was created for, to snuggle under blankets and stay warm? But, you say, it's nicer here. I see, so you were born to feel nice, is that it? Not to do things and experience them? But we have to sleep sometime, you say, and I agree. But nature set a limit on that, just as it did with eating and drinking, and you're over the limit. You've had more than enough of that, and when it comes to working, you're still below quota. This is usually the point where I personally would roll over and go back to sleep, but then again, I sometimes think I would have made a pretty lousy Roman. Once out of bed, the Roman farmer went off and did what farmers do. They worked all day in the fields, came home, ate some dinner, and went to bed. Since that's not a particularly interesting routine, I'm going to spend the rest of the episode focused on the lives of the folks in the city. Just remember as we go along, though, that 90% of the empire's population simply spent all day slaving away in the fields. When you get right down to it, for most Romans, that's what Roman daily life was. But again, boring. So, off to the city we go. Just as they did not linger in bed, Roman men did not linger at home either, and most were hitting the streets as soon as they physically could. Roman women during the age of the Antonines usually spent most of their days indoors, so after they woke up, they either fussed with their hair, if they were wealthy, or began the household chores, if they were too impoverished to have slaves do it for them. You'll recall from 2 weeks ago that the annual income of the average Roman was subsidized by the morning calls they paid to their patrons, and so naturally, that was the first thing the men did after waking up. The only men who remained at home during these crucial early hours were those high enough on the socioeconomic pyramid to be receiving visits rather than making them. If you were rich enough, you rolled out of bed, welcomed in the waiting mass of clients, and began dispensing the daily allotment of cash and prizes. Clients were received in order of prominence, with equites cutting ahead of the lower-class schleps and senators cutting ahead of them. The trick, then, was to get there early, so you could be received before the richy riches started showing up and forcing you to wait in the wings. That way, you could pay your respects, get your cash, and then get along with the rest of your day, or have time to hit up a few more patrons. For those of you wondering what the patron got out of all this, after all, votes were no longer a valuable pro quo, so why even bother? The answer is that for the super wealthy, even more prestigious than being surrounded by a ton of slaves was being surrounded by a ton of free citizens who called you their patron. If a large entourage of slaves was the fancy car of the Roman world, a large entourage of clients was the private jet. If you had a job, after you paid your respects to your patron, you hustled off to work. If you didn't, you called on a few more patrons and then generally loafed around the city, playing the part of spectator at legal proceedings or chariot races, depending on whether it was a work day or a holiday. The Romans didn't observe the same regular work week that we've grown accustomed to, 5 days on, 2 off. But by no means did that mean that they worked every day, or even, God forbid, 5 days in a row. The Romans loved their days off even more than we do, and each month was packed with holidays of various shapes and sizes and purposes. The old Republican calendar listed about 90 days of public holiday throughout the year, but by the reign of Claudius, that number had grown to at least 150, and that number did not include the steady stream of spontaneous holidays, festivals, and games that emperors were forever declaring to shore up support for their regime. In all, Jerome Carcopino reckoned that by the 2nd century, Romans, at least in the capital, enjoyed roughly one holiday for each day of work, and that is something I think we can all get behind. When it was, a workday, everyone was settled in fully by mid-morning. Retail shops were open in the commercial spaces that existed on the ground floor of almost every tenement building in the city. Restaurants, taverns, and inns served food and drink to passerbyers. Barbers worked on the men's daily shave that everyone was socially obligated to undergo until Hadrian finally put a stop to that unpleasant madness. Trade guilds managed the imports and exports of their city from offices adjacent to the Forum. Manufacturers, brickmakers, potters, and the like toiled in their various districts, and everywhere in between, manual laborers built, moved, picked up, and set down the ever-changing landscape of the city. The streets were crammed with people, and chaos reigned. Everyone was trying to get somewhere, and everyone else was trying to sell something, or beg for something, or announce something to those walking and riding by. The porticos of every building were jammed with makeshift businesses of every sort and run by businessmen of every nationality. Adding to the general craziness were the children of the empire, suffering through the lessons of their teachers, who usually taught in these same porticos. Adding to the chaos was the fact that these crowded streets had been laid out haphazardly and without an ounce of foresight. The city had grown organically over the centuries, and an accurate street map, if such a thing was even possible, would have just looked like a jumble of random lines. Some roads crossed themselves, others were far too narrow for the arterial traffic they now bore, while others led to nowhere at all. In setting up colony cities, the Romans always planned the streets using a grid system centered on a well-calculated axis. But the mother city was beyond hope, the dark shame of the obsessively Type A Romans. The hustle of economic life that energized every inch of every street reached its peak in the Forum. Most cities and towns in the empire were built around a forum, the large open area that served as the center of political and economic life. This was where the ruling councils would meet, the main religious temple stood, and the primary business of any extended metropolitan area was conducted. By the 2nd century, Rome itself had long outgrown the Forum, and various rulers, Julius Caesar, Augustus, the Flavians, and most recently Trajan, all built additional forums near the original to accommodate the increase in both population and economic activity. It was in these forums, too, that the famously litigious Romans sued the bejesus out of each other. Every day, in various public buildings around the various forums, judges, jurors, lawyers, defendants, plaintiffs, and spectators all crowded together to parse through the ugly business of suing and being sued. Where your case was heard and by whom it was heard depended on the facts of the case. Romans sued each other over everything, and, just like today, there were attorneys who specialized in contract law and family law and estate law, commercial law, criminal law, employment law, international law, and of course, there was the Roman equivalent of the ambulance chaser, who drummed up business by being first on the scene any time they heard of anything bad happening to anyone, anywhere. Cases were submitted and trials began each morning, and were supposed to last until around noon, but continuances, appeals, and recesses would often push things well into the late afternoon. Civil cases were usually presented to a body of jurors, overseen by one of the year's praetors. Membership in the jury pool was a mark of distinction, and the pool usually consisted of young men with political ambition. Appeals in either civil or criminal matters could be made to the supreme judicial body, which, in the 2nd century, meant the emperor, who would then be forced to come and sit in session to sort it all out all over again. Roman law probably deserves its own dedicated show, and hopefully I'll get around to writing it one of these days. The procedural intrigues alone are worth the price of admission. But today, I want to focus on the trials as an aspect of everyday life, rather than on the particulars of how the Romans kept each other honest. For the general public, the courtroom battles were a source of daily amusement when there were no games to attend. Just as in the arena, there were favorite advocates and orators who would be followed around by fans who would cheer noisily for their hero's well-turned phrase and hiss the opposing counsel. Sometimes, these fan clubs would be kept on retainer by theatrically inclined attorneys looking to stack the deck in their client's favor by packing the house with noisy supporters. The courtroom sessions would begin in the morning and were supposed to be wrapped up by noon, but, like I say, things never ended on time. By the time court adjourned at the end of the day, everyone was exhausted. The judges, from being forced to sit and listen to windbag advocates zealously and overzealously represent their clients, the attorneys from having to perform said orations, the clients from sitting and waiting and sweating out their fate, and everyone else from being crammed into too close quarters for too long. When the last case came and went, everyone quickly hurried to their favorite public bath of choice, where the average Roman spent the better part of his late afternoon. It wasn't just the courts that shut down in the afternoon. Across the city, and this is true both for Rome itself and the hundreds of municipalities across the empire who followed the capital's lead, the workday drew to a close in the early afternoon when the heat became unbearable. Siestas were a common way to break up the day as work gave way to recreation, but after catching a quick nap and maybe a light lunch of cold meat and bread, Romans of all stripes headed down to the baths. If the forum was the focal point of political and economic life, the baths were the center of social life. The public bath was a luxury that had grown in fits and starts over the course of the Republic, but by the age of the Antonines, it had developed into an indispensable part of daily life. During the Middle Republic, baths began to appear in the private residences of the rich as the virtuously dirty Roman citizen farmer gave way to the clean and cultured leader of the world's ruling class. Eventually, wealthy patrons began to construct bathhouses in their neighborhoods of residence for the general public to use. During his year as aedile in 33 BC, Agrippa took account of the public baths in Rome and came up with 170 scattered across the city. By the time his term was over, there were at least 171, as Agrippa built one himself that he generously announced would be free to the public forever. Over the course of the next century, the popularity of the baths would explode, and by the reign of Trajan, Pliny the Younger would reckon that there were more than 1,000 in Rome alone. At first, the bathhouse was a simple unit. Usually, there would be some changing rooms, a cold pool, and a hot pool, heated from an underground furnace and pipe system run by slaves. But as time passed, the bathhouse became a full-blown recreational complex. In addition to the litany of hot baths, cold baths, warm baths, private baths, air baths, steam baths, and any other kind of bath you can dream up, there were also sport rooms where you could wrestle, work out, or play one of the myriad ball games the Romans had come to love. If rigorous activity wasn't your thing, there were gardens, promenades, sitting rooms, and even libraries, all pleasantly landscaped and providing ample shade from the heat or cover from the rain. In the promenades wrapping around the complex, retail shops sprang up, with legitimate vendors selling food, drink, clothes, and jewelry, while their black market cousins dealt in less savory wares. Depending on which emperor's reign we're talking about, the baths would be open in the early or late afternoon, and at some point, an hour or two would be set aside so that women could have the baths to themselves. And that didn't mean that there wasn't mixed bathing, just that, if she wanted to, a Roman woman could bathe in peace.
The bath would then stay open until around nightfall. Some citizens came and went quickly, staying just long enough to get clean, but others began to see the baths as the whole point of life. These loafers would line up and wait for the doors to open, and then stay until they were kicked out at closing time. Everyone in between these two extremes would enjoy a leisurely bath, maybe work out a bit, or stroll through the gardens before returning to the hustle and bustle of the city. You get the very real sense that for most Romans, the bath was their sole refuge from the pressures of an otherwise hot, dirty, and noisy city. After the bath, everyone would retire to their residences to get ready for the one formal meal that the Romans actually enjoyed: dinner. As we've seen, breakfast and lunch were catch-as-catch-can meals of cold meat, bread, nuts, fruit, and water. Anything that could be eaten on the run or while preparing to be on the run. Dinner, though, was a different story. The family would actually sit down together to eat hot dishes served on real, actual plates. Though sit down is the wrong word. They would actually recline on couches, propped up on one elbow while they ate, because anything less would be uncivilized. A curious historical footnote on the subject concerns Cato the Younger, who, just before the Battle of Pharsalus, declared that he would eat sitting down in a chair until the tyrant Julius Caesar was dead. After Caesar won, Cato apparently followed through on this threat and never reclined while eating again, a small but daily protest against the fall of the Republic. But getting back to the topic at hand, on most nights, dinner was a meal shared not just with the family, but also with close friends. The Romans, in other words, were big on dinner parties. Usually good taste and size constraints kept the total numbers between 6 and 9, but the wealthy and vain liked to throw parties for 30 guests or more, with multiple tables and dozens of courses. Getting invited to dinner was serious business in Rome, and the satirists of the Imperium had a field day with the antics of freeloaders forever angling to get themselves invited to dine, and jealous potential hosts fighting over the most prestigious guests. But leaving the mockery aside, everyone invited everyone else to dinner every night, and then returned the favor the next night. Going out to eat meant going over to a friend or colleague's house for dinner, as the fancy restaurant had not yet been invented. The meal itself could range from a modest 3 or 4 courses to preposterous dozens, with intermissions in between the main eating bouts. The Romans should not be mistaken for great culinarians, but by the 2nd century, they at least had the whole empire from which to draw their ingredients. And even if preparation sometimes left a great deal to be desired, the smorgasbord of dishes was still impressive. Fish from the Mediterranean and wild game from the forest was standard fare, but boar, goose liver, oysters, and lamb all made appearances on the menu. These main dishes were served with asparagus, apples, olives, grapes, beans, pumpkins, eggs, figs, cabbage, and dozens of other exotic fruits and vegetables from across the empire and beyond. The drink of choice in all houses was wine. Often heated in the winter and chilled in the summer, aristocratic Romans took their wine selection as seriously as they do today, and often paid top dollar for the best years and vintages. Everyone else, meanwhile, drank whatever bottom-shelf jug of viscous alcohol they could afford. To underscore how important wine was to daily life, I should point out that those free grain allotments I've been talking about also included free allotments of wine, because apparently starving to death and remaining sober for a whole night were roughly equivalent catastrophes in the mind of the average Roman. Due to the limits of their distilling technology, what the Romans purchased was actually more of a wine concentrate than it was the table-ready wine that we know today. The concentrate would be mixed with water before serving, usually half and half, but sometimes as high as 1 part wine for 5 parts water. Only the most debauched hedonist actually drank the wine straight. The average dinner began around 4 in the afternoon, depending on the time of year, and lasted until just before sundown. Appetizers and main courses and desserts came in the order that we're accustomed to, and the evenings were usually interspersed with informal musical or poetic performance. But unless you and your companions were crazy brave, everyone said their goodbyes as the sun began to set. This was to ensure that guests had a chance to make it home before being engulfed by a terror more frightening than Hannibal leading an army of barbarian Gauls, the city at night. As I said, Rome had no streetlights. Folks who were out after dark had to make do with personal torches to light their way. So being out after dark was a dangerous proposition for 3 reasons. 1, Rome was a maze that was easy to get lost in during the day and almost impossible to navigate at night. One wrong turn, and you were spending the night in the street. 2, night was when the most unsavory of unsavory characters emerged from Rome's ample underbelly. That wrong turn may not just make you late, it may also get you mugged, beaten, or killed. And 3, in an attempt to decongest street traffic during the day, Julius Caesar had decreed that all commercial shipments be delivered only at night. The precedent stuck for the remaining life of the empire, which meant that the poorly lit streets of Rome were, preposterously, crammed with carts making deliveries. One wrong step, or one reckless driver, and that was it. All of this added up to the universal understanding that Rome after dark was no place anyone wanted to be. Best to be at home with the doors locked and the windows shuttered by the time the sun went down. Besides, you had to be up at dawn the next morning anyway. So that's a bit of a slice of daily life. Up at dawn, work into the afternoon, take a bath, have some dinner, and go to bed. Obviously, we could add several layers of complexity to this story, and I hope to eventually add a few of those complexing layers, and deal with things like sanitation, clothes, the theater, and of course, the races and gladiatorial shows. But for now, I think we're off to a pretty good start. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to take next week off, but we'll be back for sure in 2 weeks to go on a tour of the provinces. Then the 100th episode, then it's back to business. Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, the wars that erupted in the east and along the Danube, at least one really major plague. Then they hand off to Commodus and his assassination, the rise of Septimus Severus, and then the total political, economic, and social breakdown that accompanied the fall of his dynasty 40 years later. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 89, Provincial Matters. During the reign of Antoninus Pius, Rome was at the height of its power. The empire was large, stable, and at relative peace both internally and externally. The age of military expansion had given way to an age of bureaucratic management, and with the exception of Trajan's last hurrah, the Romans had more or less come to terms with the fact that their domains were what they were. So, what were their domains? Today, I want to go on what will have to be a high-speed tour of the empire so we can, at a minimum, touch base with each of the 42 odd provinces that now make up the Roman Empire. I'm pretty sure that number is 42, but it's hard to get an exact count, as the emperors were forever fidgeting with the borders and divisions of their administrative districts, and adding and subtracting from the list of what technically counted as a province. So maybe I should just say the now more than 40 provinces that make up the Roman Empire. I think the best thing for us to do, so this doesn't become too complicated, is to roughly follow Hadrian's first tour of the empire. Start in Italy, travel north into Gaul and Britain, then south through Hispania, then go east across North Africa, north through the Mideast, and then back west across Anatolia, into Greece and the Balkans, and then back to Italy by way of the Alps. This full circuit will take us through the backyards of the roughly 65 million people living within the Roman Empire and into the camps of the 30 legions stationed along the borders, protecting the Pax Romana. Before we get started, I should remind everyone that in the age of the Antonines, the Augustan constitutional settlements of 27 and 23 BC were still in effect, and that the Roman Empire was divided between senatorial and imperial provinces. Barring a few exceptions, the former were composed of peaceful interior provinces, while the latter were composed of the more militant border provinces. The distinction between the two can also be made by looking at which provinces contain legions. Provinces with legions were almost always imperial, while ungarrisoned provinces were usually, but not always, senatorial. The senatorial provinces, as the name suggests, were administered by the Senate, who, in theory at least, chose by lot from among their ex-praetors and ex-consuls who would be assigned as governor to what territory. In practice, though, the lots were usually predetermined and pre-approved by the emperor. Imperial provinces, on the other hand, needed no such lottery charade, as they were administered directly by the emperor. According to the settlement, the sitting princeps technically held proconsular authority over all of his provinces, and was thus merely appointing men to govern in his name. Within this system, the provinces were further divided into order of importance between major proconsular territories, minor pro-praetorial territories, and really minor pro-curatorial territories. Technically, these further distinctions required incoming governors to have served at a certain magisterial level before being granted a particular province. For example, you needed to have previously risen to the rank of consul if you wanted to govern Syria, but only to the rank of praetor if you wanted to govern Lusitania. But in practice, this only applied to the senatorial provinces, and not even always then. The emperor, meanwhile, could and did appoint whoever he wanted to govern whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. The remaining pro-curatorial provinces were all imperial and were unique in that equites qualified to act as governor. These, as you can imagine, wound up being the really minor, really out-of-the-way provinces. Think Mauritania. A sitting provincial governor, whatever his rank and status, was tasked with only a few basic responsibilities, as the Romans liked to govern with a light hand. If he was in an imperial province, chances are his overriding concern was for the fitness of the legions and defense of the border. If all was well there, his next concern was for the orderly and efficient collection of taxes. In addition to this collection of revenue, a governor would further act as a sort of provincial auditor who kept an eye on the books and made sure corruption and inefficiency did not unnecessarily weigh down his corner of the empire. Unless he was corrupt, in which case his job was to make sure that he skimmed as much as possible without getting caught. In between drilling the legions and cooking the books, governors also acted as the supreme judicial authority in their provinces, and would travel from district to district, hearing cases and parceling out justice. Being just one man, these basic responsibilities took up all of the governor's time, with the rest of the day-to-day operations of a province either delegated to local elites or simply left to the great wheel of anonymous inertia. Finally, before we get started, I want to mention that I have posted a link to a pretty sweet map of the empire from Wikipedia, so if you want to follow along at home, just go to thehistoryofrome.typepad.com and click on the link. I also want to mention that provincial names do not exactly roll off the tongue, so I apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. Keeping all of these things in mind, let's get going on our tour because, as it turns out, this is a massive episode, and when recorded, will easily be the longest in the history of Rome. I figure we'll blow past the as-of-yet uncracked 30-minute mark somewhere around the Hellespont and still have Greece and the Balkans to go. So everyone ready? Okay, let's go. The Italia of the Roman Empire more or less conformed to the borders of modern Italy itself. You'll recall that prior to the Second Triumvirate, the land north of the Rubicon River had been its own province, Cisalpine Gaul, or literally Gaul on this side of the Alps. But that Octavian merged the territory with Italia proper, having witnessed the danger posed to Rome by rogue generals commanding troops on the near side of the Alps, specifically
He was thinking of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Following his triumph over Antony, the new emperor followed this up by stationing all the remaining legions in the provinces, leaving only the newly formed and personally loyal Praetorian Guard in Italy itself. Except during extreme emergencies or after the breakout of a civil war, there would not be any legionary presence in Italy for the remainder of the empire, which was just fine by the local population. Native-born Italians enjoyed the further perk of being more or less exempt from direct taxation, which was in part a holdover from the early days of the expanding Republic, when Rome demanded soldiers from her new Italian allies rather than cash payments. But it was also a conscious policy to keep those closest to Rome happiest, so as to avoid mass uprisings. Except for the brief detour through Hadrian's very unpopular administrative reforms, Italians also enjoyed a great deal of local autonomy. Julius Caesar had broken the peninsula into 17 districts, each centered around an urban center, and it was left to the councils of the individual districts to govern themselves. The emperor and the Senate technically had jurisdiction, but the local elites took it very personally when either came snooping around in their business, and so Rome generally took a hands-off approach to her nearest neighbors. In general, Italia was fat and happy during the imperial period, protected from invasion by the buffer of the provinces, blessed with abundant natural resources, rich soil, and benefiting from the lion's share of the emperor's generous largesse. If it was good to be a Roman citizen during the age of the Antonines, it was great to be an Italian one. Off the coast of the peninsula were the first provinces outside of Italy to come under Roman control. The first was Sicily, claimed officially and undisputedly at the conclusion of the Punic Wars. The most important breadbasket of Rome, the rich soil of the island, provided the food that almost single-handedly fed the empire until Augustus claimed the even bigger breadbasket of Egypt for Rome. Despite its proximity to Italy and its early entrance into the empire, Sicily remained a rural backwater, dominated by the slave estates of a few wealthy senators who cared little for anything but growing crops and selling them back to the state. Conditions on the island were harsh, and 2 slave uprisings in the 100s BC were bad enough that Spartacus's war is classified as merely the third servile war. North of Sicily were the sister islands of Corsica and Sardinia, claimed by the Romans in between the Punic Wars in 231 BC. The natives were hostile to Roman rule, and so, content to keep to their coastal settlements, the Romans mostly left the rugged interior to the locals, which was an agreement that seemed to work well for everyone. In general, Corsica and Sardinia had little political or economic impact on the greater empire, but for a time they practically held the fate of the Mediterranean in their hands, as first Julius Caesar and then Octavian relied on the grain coming out of the 2 islands to feed their armies. Had anything happened to disrupt the food supply coming from those relatively unimportant islands, the history of the world may have been very different. The first official territory outside Italy claimed by the Romans on the European mainland, not counting their still undefined holdings in Spain, had been Transalpine Gaul, or Gaul on the far side of the Alps, which was annexed in 121 BC. The territory stretched from the Alps in the east along the Mediterranean coast to the Pyrenees in the west. The Romans had previously entered into an agreement with the local Greek colony of Massilia to allow the Romans passage from Italy to Spain in exchange for Roman protection from the barbarian Gauls in the north. After the legion successfully campaigned against the northern Gauls in 123 BC, the territory was officially brought into the burgeoning Roman Empire. The strip of land thereafter became known to the Romans affectionately as our province, a name which has stuck with the region over the years, and the French know it today as Provence. North of our province was the wild interior of Gallia Comata, or long-haired Gaul. Long the setting of many a Roman nightmare, Julius Caesar finally banished those particular demons in the 50s BC and brought everything east of the Rhine, south of the English Channel, and west of the Atlantic Ocean under Roman control. In 22 BC, Marcus Agrippa divided the country into 3 separate provinces to better reflect economic and geographic divisions. Lugdunensis, the most important of the three, containing both the Roman capital of Lugdunum, hence the name, and a major imperial mint. Aquitania, which bordered Spain and wound up a minor propraetorial province run by the Senate, and Belgica, which formed today's Low Countries and was the last and least Romanized of the three Gauls. There never was a single Gallic race, and even Agrippa's rezoning did little to accurately reflect the realities of the multiple and rival Gallic tribes that lived in the country, each considering themselves independent of every other. Each year, though, all the kings and chieftains would meet in Lugdunum for a ceremony that formalized the one bitter reality they all shared. Rome was in charge, and the emperor was their master. It wasn't really that bad, though. Most of the truly independent-minded chiefs had been killed, leaving behind a tribal elite that had been quickly and thoroughly Romanized. Except for a few minor flare-ups and one big transgression in 260 AD, which we'll get to one of these days, the provinces of Gaul remained a loyal and stable corner of the empire, providing from its rich land a variety of agricultural products, including by far the best cheese, and from its talented locals, high-quality glass, metal, and woodwork. East of the Gallic provinces were the military zones of Germania Inferior and Germania Superior. Until Domitian, the zones were technically a part of Belgica and Lugdunensis respectively, but in reality, the generals commanding the legions along the Rhine were autonomous, and so Domitian turned the two zones into true provinces to better reflect this reality in the 80s AD. The character of the German provinces was dominated by their strategic defensive position. 2 legions were stationed on the Lower Rhine and 2 on the Upper Rhine, making it one of the most militarized territories in the empire. Until the focus of Roman war-making shifted to the Danube in the early 100s AD, the Rhine legions were the most fearsome fighting force in the Roman world and were tasked with fending off the menace of German invasion. In addition to formalizing their provincial status, you'll recall that Domitian also spent a great deal of time and attention constructing the Limes Germanicus, which not only served as a defensive barrier, but was also a way to control trade coming in and going out of the empire. Specifically, the highly lucrative trade in amber. One of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world and found in abundance along the Baltic coast, it would be shipped down along the so-called Amber Road to Rome, with gold returning in kind. Domitian made sure that the Roman state got a piece of the action both ways by forcing traders through the gates of his well-armed limes. Across the English Channel from mainland Europe was the foggy island of Britannia, which became an imperial proconsular province following Claudius's invasion in 43 AD. The island may have seemed an unimportant little piece of land, but the 3 legions stationed there tell a different story. Aside from Syria, no single province housed as many permanent legions as Britannia, which begs us to ask the question, why? The answer is that Britain contained abundant natural resources that were inconveniently located beneath the feet of unruly, independent-minded locals. In addition to gold, silver, tin, iron, lead, and marble that could all be dug up in great heaps, Britain also provided the empire with wool, timber, animal skins, slaves, due to the persistent revolts, and, of course, the best hunting dogs money could buy. This combination of natural wealth and angry locals added up to one of the most militant provinces in the empire. Hadrian settled the northern border of the province with the famous wall he ordered built in 122, though Antoninus built his own wall about 100 miles north that became the new border of the empire for about 20 years until it was abandoned for a variety of reasons in the 160s AD. Despite its unruly natives, Britannia would remain a lucrative corner of the empire until it was abandoned in the 400s by a Western Roman Empire facing both internal division and external barbarian invasion. South of Britannia and across the Pyrenees from Gaul lay the Iberian Peninsula, which the Romans called Hispania. Long in the Roman orbit, it was actually one of the last territories in the empire to be truly pacified, holding out until Marcus Agrippa finally dealt the decisive blow against Spanish independence.
The Roman foothold in Spain, originally restricted to the Mediterranean coast, had been won by Scipio Africanus during the Second Punic War, and was settled initially by his wounded veterans. The territory along the coast Scipio had snatched from the Carthaginians was divided into Hispania Ulterior and Hispania Citerior, or literally, further Spain and nearer Spain, which would remain the Roman administrative districts until 13 BC, when, following Agrippa's final pacification efforts, Augustus divided the now wholly owned Iberian Peninsula into Lusitania, basically modern Portugal, Baetica, modern Andalusia, and the largest of the three, Tarraconensis. Ironically, once the Spanish tribes were finally beaten down after 200 years of near constant warfare, the peninsula only required a single legion stationed in Tarraconensis to maintain order. Hispania was one of the richest and most important regions in the empire. Its gold and silver mines were the best in the known world, and the Romans developed complex hydraulic mining techniques to extract every last ounce of precious metal from the Spanish mines. But beyond the geologic resources, which included marble, tin, and lead, the fertile Spanish countryside made Hispania a center of olive oil and wine production. These two products alone, the liquid that kept the empire running, would have been enough even without the gold mines to make the province of Spain wealthy beyond measure. As we've seen, by the age of the Antonines, the Roman-Spanish elite formed a powerful faction within the Senate, producing at the height of its power two of the best emperors the Romans ever had, Trajan and Hadrian. Across the Strait of Gibraltar, which was either carved by or narrowed by Hercules, depending on who you ask, lay the twin provinces of Mauritania, Mauritania Tingitana and Mauritania Caesariensis, both of which were minor procuratorial provinces on the northwest African coast. Following the victory over Carthage, the territory was made a client kingdom dominated by its eastern neighbor Numidia, which was the preeminent Roman client state in West Africa at the time. In 40 AD, for no real reason at all, Caligula lured the loyal king of Mauritania into a trap and had him executed, claiming the leaderless kingdom as his own personal domain, hence the name Caesariensis. Revolt followed, but Claudius decided that what was done and formally annexed the kingdom in 43 AD. Mauritania's primary contribution to the empire was wool and a high-quality, always in-demand purple dye, though it was also known for providing the legions with excellent light cavalrymen. Eventually, the province would become troubled by local Berbers, the dark-skinned North African natives, who had resisted first Phoenician, then Carthaginian, then Roman encroachment. The Berbers of Mauritania became known as Moors, Mauritania, get it? And would eventually wreak havoc on the undermanned but incredibly rich province of Hispania, beginning during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. East of Mauritania was the province of Africa proper. The heart of the old Carthaginian Empire, Rome had claimed the territory after the final destruction of Carthage in 146 BC. The Romans were initially somewhat ambivalent about governing overseas territory, and their primary concern in Africa was simply to ensure that no other power established itself in Carthage's place. For the most part, though, the loyal client kingdom of Numidia was the one actually tasked with doing the heavy lifting of keeping Africa free from anti-Roman sentiment. Once Rome finally embraced its international character, though, Africa became a key center of agricultural production, providing the empire with a huge array of olives, corn, bean, figs, grapes, textiles, marble, wine, timber, livestock, pottery, and wool. Coastal cities became highly developed and fully Romanized, becoming major trade centers as well as producing high-quality crafts of their own, including their famous clay lamps, which became the class of the empire. After Augustus's final constitutional settlement, Africa had the unique distinction of being the only senatorial province that contained a legion, which was also, by the way, the only African legion stationed west of Egypt. In between Africa and Egypt was the senatorial province of Cyrenaica, which was a minor agricultural province that was distinguished by its wide variety of native medicinal plants.
Most Romans barely registered Cyrenaica's existence until the Third Jewish Revolt erupted from its borders in 132. The slaughter and counter-slaughter that accompanied the revolt left the province depopulated to the point of it becoming something of a ghost town, forcing Hadrian to concoct a colonization program to prevent the lights from going out completely. To the east of obscure Cyrenaica was the incalculably important prefecture of Egypt. The rich Nile Valley was so critical that it wasn't even technically a province, and remained instead, from the time of Augustus, a country owned personally by the emperor. It was governed by an equestrian prefect, as Augustus and his successors felt that a senator could not be trusted with the task. Ruling in Alexandria was an easy stepping stone to ruling the entire world, and so no one of senatorial rank was even allowed to visit Egypt without express imperial permission. This was, you'll recall, possibly the reason why Tiberius had Germanicus killed. Egypt was not only the breadbasket of the empire and the key transfer point of trade with India and the Far East, but its capital of Alexandria was the center of culture, science, and the arts in the Greco-Roman world. Unfortunately for locals and Romans alike, though, imperial control of Egypt, enforced by the two legions run out of Alexandria, was often heavy-handed and arbitrary. Taxes were administered and collected heavily and randomly, leaving the locals resentful and the Romans hated, and from the late 130s on, Egypt was a constant source of anti-Roman agitation and revolt. But through it all, the ancient kingdom on the Nile River continued to pump out the grain that fed the empire. East of Egypt was Arabia, comprising most of what we now call the Sinai Peninsula. One of the last additions to the empire, Arabia was annexed by Trajan in 106, and was one of the few territories not abandoned by Hadrian when he came to power a decade later. Taken and held mostly so that the Romans could control all the trade routes into the Mediterranean, Arabia wound up a surprisingly stable province, and was a loyal and lucrative corner of the empire well into the Byzantine age. Its single legion was famous for refusing to back eastern pretenders to the throne like Avidius Cassius and Pescennius Niger, instead choosing to remain loyal to whoever ruled in Rome. Polar opposite of loyal Arabia was its northwestern neighbor, the once vigorously rebellious Judea, but now the utterly depopulated and weak Palestinia. I kind of feel like we've already spent enough time on this rebellious little province that never seemed particularly rich enough or important enough to have been the source of so much trouble. Their primary exports wound up being slaves and refugees fleeing for their lives. North of Judea-Palestinia was Syria, the key province of the Eastern Roman Empire. Conquered and organized by Pompey as he went east young man in the 60s BC, it housed 3 and sometimes 4 standing legions, and was the main staging point for all operations against the Parthians, with whom this critical territory shared a border. The provincial capital of Antioch became a hugely important urban center, and was the de facto capital of the Roman East. Complementing its rigid defense against incoming eastern armies, Syria simultaneously embraced all the incoming trade from the east, and became a decadent and wealthy middleman acting as the overland terminus of the famous Silk Road coming in from China. Proper Romans, though, forever held Syria up as the example of everything that was wrong with exposing Rome to eastern temptations. The legions stationed there were constantly accused of showing lax discipline, and the soldiers castigated for constantly going native amidst a population more than willing to corrupt their supposed masters. But despite its reputation for loose morals, no one could deny that without Syria, the empire would have been far less rich and far less powerful than it had become. The imports and exports that passed through and originated from its borders generated the gold and supplies that allowed Roman power to explode exponentially following Pompey's annexation. Round the bend from Syria were the provinces of Anatolia. Directly bordering Syria were Cilicia, which hugged the Mediterranean coast, and Cappadocia, which headed up into the Taurus Mountains. Cappadocia was an imperial province that, thanks to its shared border with Armenia and Greater Mesopotamia, wound up housing 2 legions. The province that would become best known for its series of underground cities is, to me anyway, best known as the province that always backed the wrong side in a war, yet still managed to escape major reprisals. The Cappadocians backed first Antiochus against the Romans, then Mithridates against the Romans, then Pompey against Julius Caesar, then Brutus and Cassius against the Second Triumvirate, then Antony against Octavian. In every case they lost, and yet somehow managed to ingratiate themselves enough with the winner that they were ever after accepted as loyal allies of the victors. I would guess, though, that the 2 legions now stationed in their backyard was promise enough of their loyalty. To the south was Cilicia, a senatorial province that needed no legions. Combined administratively with the island of Cyprus, Cilicia was most famous for its rugged western half being a haven for pirates, until Pompey burned all their ships and turned the erstwhile brigands into fouler-mouthed than average farmers. But the eastern half of Cilicia was composed of rich flats that produced millet, olives, and sesame, in addition to providing excellent pasture land for substantial herds of goats and cattle. West of Cilicia was Lycia Pamphylia. It was also a Roman province. West of Cappadocia and northwest of Cilicia was the unimpressive but still unique province of Galatia, which literally translates as Gaul of the East. It was known by this seemingly out-of-place name because the territory, mostly high plateau, had been settled by a group of migrating Gauls in the 280s BC. They retained their semi-nomadic pastoral lifestyle and enriched themselves by launching periodic raids on the richer kingdoms surrounding them. The Galatians initially joined with Antiochus and then Mithridates as they attempted to resist Roman expansion, but by the end of Sulla's eastern campaign, they had attached themselves firmly to the Roman cause and remained a loyal and nominally independent client kingdom until the last Galatian king died in 25 BC, just as Augustus was defining the new imperial political order. Galatia was annexed and claimed by the emperor as one of his new imperial provinces. Thereafter, it was a provincial backwater, best known for the fact that, because it was a provincial backwater, early Christianity was able to flourish there relatively unmolested by the Roman authorities. North of Galatia and Cappadocia were the often combined provinces of Bithynia and Pontus, which together ran the length of the southern Black Sea coast. The rich valleys of Pontus had been the home of some of Rome's fiercest enemies during the 1st and 2nd centuries BC, but by the age of the Antonines, all such resistance was dead, and the locals contented themselves as tradesmen, farmers, and as particularly good iron and steel smiths. Their sister province of Bithynia had the good fortune of being located at the crossroads of Asia and Europe, leading its urban centers along the Sea of Marmara to become rich and important trading powers. The Bithynian interior was rugged and forested, and the locals liked to boast that they were one of the few places on earth that Alexander had been unable to conquer outright. The Macedonian king had instead decided to simply keep moving when the fierce locals took to the mountains, rather than bog his army down in a protracted siege of the dense, steep countryside. The province, then a client kingdom, also wound up being a thorn in Julius Caesar's side, as he was dogged for years by rumors that he had gone to bed as the passive partner with the king of Bithynia. You'll recall that his enemies often scribbled graffiti on the walls of Rome, calling Caesar the Queen of Bithynia. Bithynia Pontus was also the corrupt and disorganized province that Trajan had sent Pliny the Younger to straighten out in the early 100s AD, a difficult task that at best produced mixed results. The rest of the west coast of Anatolia was swallowed by the province of Asia, a senatorial province that had been brought into the empire following the death of King Attalus of Pergamum in 129 BC. His kingdom had been created as a buffer client state following the withdrawal of Antiochus in 190 BC, and, with no male heirs, Attalus simply left the kingdom to Rome in his will. This territorial windfall was a political windfall in particular for Gaius Gracchus, who argued forcefully and then violently that Asia ought to be carved up democratically, rather than being handed over to a couple of rich patricians. After years of indifferent Roman rule, Mithridates invaded and slaughtered every Roman he could find in the Asiatic Vespers of 88 BC, prompting Sulla to take revenge and reclaim the territory for Rome, in whose sphere of influence it remained until the fall of the Byzantine Empire. Asia was characterized most especially by its decentralized political structure. Dozens of coastal Greek colonies, each more ancient and storied than the last, vied with each other for prominence and refused to let any of the others gain the upper hand. In their race to secure the emperor's favor, Asia wound up being the first territory to really embrace the practice of worshipping the cult of the Caesars, and emperor worship became deeper and wider spread in Asia than just about anywhere else in the empire. Across the Hellespont from Asia was Thracia, supposed homeland of everyone's favorite gladiator Spartacus. The land between Macedonia and the Sea of Marmara had been one of Rome's undefined holdings that was annexed officially by Claudius as he and his ministers attempted to make the empire run more rationally. The rugged country was known for its disparate local tribes who seemed to hate each other more than they hated the Romans. Down the road, the province will produce a number of notable soldier emperors, including the beast Maximinius Thrax, whose assassination of Alexander Severus helped spark the crisis of the 3rd century, and Constantine's great colleagues/rivals Galerius and Licinius, whose demise helped close the door on that particular century of chaos. North of Thracia was the province of Moesia, eventually divided by Domitian into upper and lower halves to make the whole territory more militarily agile. The superior and inferior in this case referring to the downhill path of the Danube rather than the Rhine. The country had been finally conquered by the grandson of Marcus Crassus around 29 BC, but it was not organized as a province until at least 6 AD. Located on the south bank of the Danube, Moesia became one of the keys to the whole Roman defensive strategy, and 4 legions were stationed there permanently, 2 each in the upper and lower sections. Its strategic military value was never in doubt, though its responsibilities were lightened somewhat by Trajan's conquest of Dacia in 105, which pushed the northern border across the Danube and left Upper Moesia at least an interior province. Beyond its military value, Moesia also came equipped with gold fields in the west and excellent farmland in the east, and obviously its location along the Danube left it in control of most of the international trade coming down that great river, making Moesia rich, which was nice, but also leaving it the constant target of envious Germans on the north bank, which wasn't so nice. This was why the locals in Moesia were enthusiastic supporters of Trajan's Dacian conquest, and hoped for more where that came from. They would be let down by Hadrian, though, and Dacia would be the last major province added to the empire and the only Roman territory on the far side of the Danube. Its abundant mineral resources, especially in the gold and silver department, gave the Roman economy a much-needed shot in the arm, though it proved to be a tenuously held territory at best. Hadrian had wanted to withdraw, but was compelled by economic and political necessity to retain what he considered an indefensible position. The money flowing in was nice, though, and while it lasted, Dacia was a key cog in the imperial minting machine. The province would eventually be split into upper and lower departments by Hadrian after he determined he could not just let go of the province altogether, and at some point, during either his reign or Antoninus's, a 3rd province was spun off, leading the Romans to call them all collectively the 3 Dacias. Among the last territories added to the empire, Dacia was also one of the first to be abandoned, and it was left to its fate by Aurelian in 275 AD, though pointedly only after he had decisively beaten the Goths in battle and killed their leader. South of Moesia was the cradle of Greek civilization, now called Macedonia and Achaia. Finally conquered by the Romans during the Third Macedonian War in 146 BC, the exhausted Greeks were forced to give up their independence and accept foreign rule. Out of respect for the great and ancient civilization they had just defeated, and which they admired so much, Rome pretty much left the cities of Greece free to govern themselves. Macedonia was obviously harder hit by the last war than the cities around the Peloponnese, and for a while it limped along a depopulated mess. But with the construction of the Via Egnatia, a major Roman road from Dyrrhachium to the Hellespont, it was revitalized and rode its booming business in trade and travel back to prominence. Achaia, meanwhile, less chastened by the Macedonian wars, tried to hold on to its independence more forcefully than their northern neighbors. Believing themselves simply better than the barbarian Romans, the Greeks of Athens and Sparta treated their new overlords with barely concealed contempt. When Mithridates came calling in the 80s BC, promising to lead the whole of the East to freedom, the Greek elites readily agreed to help out. Sulla made them pay for their defiance and famously sacked Athens in brutal fashion in 87 BC. Thereafter, the chastened Greeks, while still feeling superior, were far less inclined to act on their contempt. For the next century, the once mighty Greek city-states languished as a fallen backwater. Athens retained its traditional status as a cultural center, but it had long been eclipsed by Alexandria as the cultural center of the Mediterranean world. It wasn't really until Hadrian's active Greek revivalism that the cities of the Aegean began to return to prosperity and prominence. The craftsmen of Greece, meanwhile, produced a number of high-quality household goods that were highly sought after in Rome, and the rugged country was a source of high-quality tin and copper. But by far, Greece's most important contribution to the Roman economy was its export of educated slaves, who, in time, came to run practically the whole empire. Overtly conquered, the Greeks had a bit of revenge by covertly running in many ways the empire they supposedly served. West of Achaia, and for a long time simply a part of Macedonia, was the province of Epirus. Conquered along with the rest of Greece in the Macedonian Wars, and peeled off into its own province in 67 AD, this maritime territory was situated along the Ionian Sea across from the boot of Italy. Originally one of the Romans' first footholds in the east, remember that the Romans took possession of the coast in the mid-200s BC to prevent piracy, the culture and economy of Epirus was centered around its port towns servicing the trade lines from Italy to Greece proper, though it was also known for producing its own excellent cheese, wine, and oils. Northwest of Greece and due west of Moesia was the critical region known as Illyrium or Illyricum. First conquered by the Romans in the 160s BC, the region wasn't fully pacified until Octavian put the final stamp on things in the mid-30s BC. In the constitutional settlement of 27, Augustus claimed Illyricum as an imperial province and eventually stationed 4 legions there. Illyricum wound up being the backbone of the Roman Empire as it stood at the crossroads between east and west, north and south. It bordered both the Adriatic Sea and the Danube River, and depending on where you were coming from, it was the gateway to Italy, the gateway to Greece, the gateway to the Far East, while all the while acting as defender of the northern border. At some point during the reign of Tiberius, Illyricum was split into the more peaceful and mineral-rich Dalmatia in the south, which is now the Croatian coast, and the more rugged and militant Pannonia in the north. Pannonia would then be divided further by Trajan into Upper and Lower Pannonia to make the territory, like Moesia, more agile and responsive to attacks. Illyricum in general has been called the province that held the empire together, as its constantly under-arms population formed the bulk of the critical Danube legions and eventually produced the emperors that dragged Rome from the depths of the disastrous 3rd century, Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian, and then finally Diocletian. Neighboring Pannonia to the west, as Europe begins to climb up into the Alps, was the imperial province of Noricum, composing most of modern Austria. Granted independence by Julius Caesar for taking his side during the Civil War, the Noric people were left alone until they made a fateful decision to join in a Pannonian uprising in 16 BC that eventually, once put down, led to Noricum being called a province, even if it was not formally organized as such, until Claudius noted that they were still in off-the-books territory in 41 AD. For years, Noricum was ungarrisoned, but Antoninus moved a legion into the country in order to shore up the northern border, perhaps anticipating the storm that he saw coming down from Germania. Lacking high-quality soil, Noricum was a classic iron and blood province, providing both high-quality steel and high-quality soldiers for the legions. We wind up then finally, and, rather anticlimactically, in Raetia, an Alpine province composed of modern west-central Switzerland. Conquered during the joint campaign of Tiberius and Drusus, Raetia was a classic example of the Romans making a desert and calling it a peace. Though it had no permanent legionary presence, Raetia still wound up a key part of the extended Limes Germanicus, holding down the eastern portion of the fortification network with a locally raised militia. Relatively depopulated, the native Raetians produced cheeses, pitch, honey, and a particular brand of wine that Augustus declared was his favorite in the whole empire. So there you have it. In making this circuit of the empire, I think the only thing I missed were the 3 tiny administrative districts in the Alps, organized in 14, 47, and 63 AD respectively, to protect communication lines and keep travel routes through the Alpine passes clear. By all means, though, if I miss something, please let me know. I should probably at this point knock out a nice concluding paragraph that artfully condenses the many faces and many places of the Roman Empire, but the tour has left me exhausted. Next week is question time. See you then.